Hello students, welcome to my subject Psycholinguistics. Course code English 374, lecture number 7. Today we are going to discuss language learning theories. The outlines for today's lecture are: we are going to start with the introduction of the topic. Then we will talk about linguistics in general, and of course about psycholinguistics, language acquisition, learning stages, and language learning theories. Now, the introduction to the topic. How do children learn to speak? Behavioral theory assumes that children imitate what they hear, and thanks to continuous positive reinforcement, children learn language through conditioning and habit formation. A great many theories regarding language development in human beings have been proposed in the past and still being proposed in the present time. No matter who has the reason, language teachers must have knowledge not only about the discipline they are teaching, but also about how children learn a language. It's one of the theories of language learning, behavioral theory. And the theories regarding language development in human beings have been proposed in the past and still being proposed in the present time, no matter who has the reason. Language teachers must have knowledge not only about the discipline they are teaching, but also about how children learn a language. Linguistics is actually the scientific study of the human language. It can be broadly broken into three categories of language: language form, language meaning, and language in context. One subfield of linguistics is the study of language structure or grammar. This focuses on the system of rules followed by the users of a language. And language form, language meaning, and language in context. First of all, that it starts with morphology, is the study of morphology, the formation and composition of words. How do we form and compose words? Syntax, the formation and composition of phrases and sentences from these words. Semantics starts with the study of language meaning, is concerned with how languages imply logical structures and real-world references to convey, process, and assign meaning, as well as to manage and resolve ambiguity. This includes the study of semantics, how meaning is inferred from words and concepts. Phonology the study of speech sounds in their cognitive aspects. Phonetics, the study of speech sounds in their physical aspects and how they are produced and perceived. And another, that is pragmatics, that we mostly how meaning is inferred from context. Linguistics also looks at the broader context in which language is influenced by social, cultural, historical, and political factors. Psycholinguistics are the psychology of language. It is the study of the psychological and neurobiological factors that enable humans to acquire. Language acquisition is to acquire, use, and understand language. Psycholinguistics covers the cognitive process that make it possible to generate a grammatical and meaningful sentence out of vocabulary and grammatical structures, as well as the processes that make it possible to understand utterances, words, text, etc. Developmental psycholinguistics studies children's ability to learn language. Language comprehension. Development psycholinguistics study how word meaning, sentence meaning, and discourse meaning are computed and represented in the mind. They study how complex words and sentences are composed in speech and how they are broken down into their constituents in the acts of listening and reading. In short, psycholinguistics seek to understand how language is done. How do children acquire language acquisition? How do people process and comprehend language comprehension? How language is being produced, language production. How do people produce language? And psycholinguistics is an interdisciplinary field, hence it is studied by researchers from a variety of different backgrounds such as psychology, cognitive science, linguistics, and speech and language pathology. Psycholinguistics study many different topics, but these topics can generally be divided into answering these four things: language acquisition, language comprehension, language production, and second language acquisition or learning. How do adults acquire or learn a new language? Psycholinguistics talks about all these four things. Language acquisition. Language acquisition is the process by which humans acquire the capacity to perceive, to produce, to understand, and to communicate. It involves the picking up of diverse capacities, including syntax, phonetics, and an extensive vocabulary. However, learning a first language is something that every normal child does successfully without much need for formal lessons. Language development is no doubt a complex and unique human quality, but yet children seem to acquire language at a very rapid rate, with most children's speech being relatively grammatical by age 3. Grammar, which is a set of mental rules that characterizes all of the sentences of a language, must be mastered in order to learn a language. Most children in a linguistic community seem to succeed in covering on a grammatical system equivalent to everyone else in the community with few wrong turns, which is quite remarkable considering the complexity of the system. By the time a child utters a first word, according to the Linguistic Society of America, he or she has already spent many months playing around with the sounds and intonations of language, but there is still no one point at which all children learn to talk. Children acquire language in stages, and different children reach various stages at different times. Although they have one thing in common, and that is that children learning the same language will follow an almost identical pattern in the sequence of stages they go through. These learning stages usually consist of cooing. The age of six months old use phonemes from every language. The second stage, that is babbling stage, starts at the age of 9 months. So they selectively use phonemes from their native language. The third, that is one-word utterances. At the age of 12 months, start using single words. In telegraphic speech, at the age of 2 years, multi-word utterances that lack in function. In last, that is normal speech, at the age of 5, almost normal developed speech. Learning is one of the most important activities in which humans engage. It is at the very core of the educational process. Although most of what people learn occurs outside of school, not just inside the school or in the classroom. For thousands of years, philosophers and psychologists have sought to understand the nature of learning, how it occurs, how one person can influence the learning of another person through teaching and similar endeavors. Various theories of learning have been suggested, and these theories differ for a variety of reasons. A theory most simply is a combination of different factors or variables woven together in an effort to explain whatever the theory is about. Now, the first, behaviorism, or the behaviorist view of language learning. Boris Frederick Skinner theory. According to B.F. Skinner, the process of language learning, according to behaviorists, can be explained in terms of conditioning. The child begins to hear during the first year of his life a large number of speech sounds produced by his parents. Gradually, he learns to associate these sounds with the situations which accompany them. For instance, the child learns to recognize the sound of endearment which his mother produces when she feeds him. After some time, these sounds become pleasurable in themselves, even when they are not accompanied by food. At this stage, conditioning to language has begun. The more frequently the child is exposed to this process of conditioning, the stronger its effect, which the child obtains from the conditioning process. Operant condition. At this stage, conditioning to language has begun. The more frequently the child is exposed to this process of conditioning, the stronger its effect, which the child obtains from the conditioning process. Before long, the child begins to imitate some of speech sounds that he has heard. The child does so in an attempt to control the environment and to invite the attention of his mother. The operant conditioning is behavioral psychology was born years before Skinner published his studies. It is a procedure by which we can induce a reflex, a response to an animal, and in some cases to a person, with experiments such as like the classical conditioning of Watson and Palo. Before that, it was given that behavioral psychology goes with the four basic principles of behavior. Our psychology is a science, therefore it will use an empirical and demonstrable experimental methodology. In the case of operant conditioning, it is essential to learn about what happens after the behavior is required. For example, in the case of Skinner's box, the rat learns that after pressing the button, it receives a prize. As we have seen, operant conditioning is somewhat more complicated than the classical conditioning of Watson and Palo. In this case, the association is not between a stimulus and a reflection, but between a stimulus, a behavior, and a reinforcement. And for that, he went with an experiment with a rat. A rat was introduced inside the box. Normally, it was deprived of food before, so that its motivation to feed was great. The rat experimented in its new environment until it discovered the button and pressed it. Automatically, a food unit pellet left the dispenser after the button was pressed. The rat, motivated to get more food, modified its behavior and quickly learned to press the button to receive food. Behavior association encouragement and positive reinforcement are the two main points of this theory. Conditioning could also occur by the omission of a negative stimulus, negative reinforcement. In this case, the rat was put into the box with the electrified floor. If it pressed the button, the current stopped passing through the floor. In this way, the rat learned to push the button to stop feeling pain. Positive and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement, an element that acts as a reward, usually meets some basic needs or generates a pleasurable response. Behaviorism is actually based on measuring behaviors. Everything that happens in the conditioning of Skinner is thoroughly analyzed and categorized. Therefore, we can distinguish two types of reinforcement here, positive and negative. Positive element is a reward, usually meets some basic needs or generates a pleasurable response. Negative reinforcement, an element that generates a response of pain, displeasure, or discomfort, acts as a punishment. Reward and punishment. It strengthens the behavior. Reinforcement, positive reinforcement means rewards, and negative punishment that strengthens the behavior of a child. Punishment, it comes in the category of negative reinforcement. Response caste, reward, and this is how we learn a language, through reinforcement, through punishment, and but here we must note that point that behaviorism does not distinguish between the language of human being and that of animal, like he did the experiment on a rat. To sum up, the behaviorist theory believes that infants learn oral language from other human role models through a process involving imitation, rewards, and practice. Human role models in an infant's environment provide the stimuli and rewards. When a child attempts oral language or imitates the sounds or speech patterns, they are usually praised and given affection for their efforts. Thus, praise and affection become the rewards. However, the behaviorist theory is criticized for a variety of reasons. If rewards play such a vital component in language development, what about the parent who is inattentive or not present when the child attempts speech? Extinction weaken behavior. The cognitive view of language learning. By Jean Piaget, and he presented the 4 stages in the cognitive development of language learning. It comes in the theory sensory motor stage, pre-operational stage, as the pre-motor stage starts at the age of 2 years, differentiates self from objects, recognizes self as agent of action, and begins to act intentionally. For example, pulls a string to set mobile in motion, or shakes a rattle to make a noise, achieves object permanence. Realizes that things continue to exist even when no longer present to the sense. Pre-operational stage starts from 2 to 7, learns to use language and to represent objects by images and words. Thinking is still egocentric, has difficulty taking the viewpoint of others, classifies objects by a single feature. For example, groups together all the red blocks regardless of shape, or all the square blocks regardless of color. The third one, that is concrete operational stages, starts at age of 7 till 11, can think logically. A child can think logically about objects and events, achieves conservation of number, age 6, mass, age 7, and weight, age 9, classifies objects according to several features and can order them in a series along a single dimension such as size. Formal operational stage, 11 years and up, can think logically about abstract propositions and test hypotheses, systematically becomes concrete, hypothetical, the future and ideological problems. The second, that is the nativist theory, is presented by Noam Chomsky in 1960s. Noam Chomsky's innateness or nativist theory proposes that children have an inborn or innate faculty for language acquisition that is biologically determined. Chomsky is perhaps the best known and the most influential linguist of the second half of the 20th century. He has made a number of strong claims about language. In particular, he suggests that language is an innate faculty. That is to say, that we are born with a set of rules about language in our heads, which he refers to as the universal grammar. According to Chomsky, infants acquire grammar because it is a universal property of language. An inborn development and has coined these fundamental grammatical ideas that all humans have as universal grammar. The universal grammar is the basic upon which all human language is built. Chomsky gives a number of reasons why this should be so. So, number first, children are exposed to very little correctly formal language. When people speak, they constantly interrupt themselves, change their minds, and make slips of the tongue, and so on. Yet children manage to learn their language all the same. Children do not simply copy the language that they hear around them. They deduce rules from it, which they can then use to produce sentences that they have never heard before. They do not learn a repertoire of phrases and sayings as the behaviorists believe, but a grammar that generates infinity of new sentences. Setting the parameters. When the child begins to listen to his parents, he will unconsciously recognize which kind of a language he is dealing with, and he will set his grammar to the correct one. This is known as setting the parameters. It is as if the child were offered at birth a certain number of hypotheses, which he or she then matches with what is happening around him. He knows intuitively that there are some words that behave like verbs and others like nouns, and that there is a limited set of possibilities as to their ordering within the phrase. This is not information that he is taught directly by the adults that surround him, but information that he receives, he creates in his mind. This set of language learning tools provided at birth is referred to by Chomsky as the language acquisition device. Language acquisition device or universal grammar. The idea of language organ in our brains that lets us learn language very quickly, particularly during the first 2-3 years of life. Nativists argue that without such a biological predisposition, it would be impossible to learn language as quickly and as thoroughly as we do. Our parents didn't teach us how to talk, yet we learned from them. How can this be? Certainly there must have been a subtle, perhaps intensive teaching process that neither our parents nor we were aware of. We begin by imitating what we hear from our parents as best we can, repeating random phrases. Our parents in subtle ways punish us for the childish speech errors we make by not responding, correcting the error, etc., and reward correct phrases by responding positively. As our speech improves, our parents respond more positively and less negatively. Essentially, nativists say that the ability to learn language is inborn, whereas behaviorists say that this is entirely learned. Social interactionist theory. Lev Vygotsky presented this theory in 1929 and 30. Vygotsky's social interaction theory incorporates nurture arguments in that children can be influenced by their environment as well as the language input children receive from their caregivers. Although the theories of Skinner, Chomsky, and Piaget are all very different and very important in their own context, they don't necessarily take into account the fact that children don't encounter language in isolation. The child is a little linguist, analyzing language from randomly encountered adult utterances. The interaction theory proposes that language exists for the purpose of communication and can only be learnt in the context of interaction with adults and older children. Sociocultural perspective. It stresses the importance of the environment and culture in which the language is being learned during early childhood development, because this social interaction is what first provides the child with the means of making sense of their own behavior and how they think about the surrounding world. However, one must remember that although social context provides support for language acquisition, it does not directly provide the knowledge that is necessary to acquire language. And this perhaps where a child's innate abilities come into play. According to Vygotsky, social interaction plays an important role in the learning process and proposed the zone of proximal development ZPD. Learners construct the new language through socially mediated interaction. The cognitive development of children and adolescents is enhanced when they work in their zone of proximal development. ZPD, zone of proximal development. To reach the ZPD, children need the help of adults or more competent individuals to support or scaffold them as they are learning new things. The zone of proximal development has been defined as the distance between the actual developmental level as determined by independent problem solving and the level of potential development as determined through problem solving under adult guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers. Good luck, and that's all about language theories.